Welcome back. You are watching Gravitas. It was a big Tuesday night for America and indeed the rest of the world. All eyes were on President Donald Trump as he addressed a joint session of the Congress outlining the plans for his term. Trump spoke about all that he needed to do and much more. To decode the Donald, we have in the studio with us Pramitpal Chaudhary, foreign editor of the Hindustan Times. Also joining us live from Boston is Glenn Carl, writer and former intelligence officer. Thanks both for joining in on the program. Pramitpal, I'll come to you first. Very briefly, just give us your opening thoughts on the entire address.
Well, in comparison to his inaugural address, which was very much like his election rhetoric, extremely dark, divisive, threatening, if you want. This was almost presidential. I mean, it was actually a speech that, while it laid out certain obvious conservative items in his agenda, particularly on health care and immigration, he was both upbeat. He spoke about minorities, about how he wanted to help working class people, minorities. And broadly was in fact a speech that you were hoping that Trump would have begun with his presidency with, and he's given it 1 month into the presidency. Okay, so a little late into the presidency, but nevertheless a more president-like speech coming out from Donald Trump. Glenn, he sounded surprisingly calm and focused and without all of the bravado and bluster that has accompanied his speeches so far. Would you agree with that?
I mean, it shows that at least one time he can read from a teleprompter a prepared speech and sound calm and rational. It was boilerplate conservative Republican positions put in a politician's uplifting way. A State of the Union address is really a visit from Santa Claus almost always. It's here are all the wonderful things I will do without ever addressing how actually they will be accomplished. You know, if every president's presentations were taken at face value, the country would be bankrupted in 24 hours. But it certainly was uplifting and positive, which is atypical, or if not unique, for Donald Trump.
Okay, so maybe because the bar had been set quite low on occasion prior to that, it seemed a little bit more uplifting than it would have otherwise. But just to give our viewers an idea of what exactly was said by Donald Trump, let's listen into some of the excerpts from that speech as our guests take the viewers through them. We'll start with the first one now.
Recent threats targeting Jewish community centers and vandalism of Jewish cemeteries, as well as last week's shooting in Kansas City, remind us that while we may be a nation divided on policies, we are a country that stands united in condemning hate and evil in all of its very ugly forms. Each American generation passes the torch of truth, liberty, and justice in an unbroken chain all the way down to the present. That torch is now in our hands, and we will use it to light up the world. I am here tonight to deliver a message of unity and strength, and it is a message deeply delivered from my heart.
Okay, Glenn Carl, he has now acknowledged that the recent hate crimes in the country took place, including that Kansas shooting. Do you believe that Trump now realizes that his stance when it comes to non-Americans could be misread by a few people?
I think he probably has always been aware of that, but he doesn't care. He has played to his base, and I'm sure will continue to do so. The tone certainly changed. It is encouraging or appropriate to hear hopeful and soothing, reassuring tones from the president. That is important. But the fact remains that he is a Jekyll and Hyde and schizophrenic and absent particular convictions other than nationalism and populism. His policies are fundamentally the same, which are to be developed, but basically nationalist. He also had some red meat, as one says, in his address for his base. He talked about creating some sort of center to look at crimes committed by violent crimes committed by illegal aliens. This is straight out of the playbook that he's had before. The tone changed, but beyond that, we'll see.
Pramit, when it comes to the Kansas shooting, he has taken his time, finally addressing it. The shooting took place last Wednesday. Sean Spicer said that it was too early to call it a hate crime on Saturday, but we've only seen the president speak up about it right now. Do you think that had the speech, or at least a reference to Kuchibhotla's murder, had come a little while earlier, he might have managed to allay the fears of a very large Indian community that currently resides in the United States?
Well, it's obviously better if he he responds just soon after the crime. But ultimately, I think, as he said, this is not a community that voted for him. So ultimately, he's not really concerned. Politically, at least on a purely political base, what the Indian American community thinks is irrelevant. It is one of the most democratically aligned groups in the country. Almost 70 to 80% vote Democrat. And he's not concerned about immigrants think at all. That's simply not part of his policy. So I don't think that he's particularly concerned. But I'm hearing is that the Republican Hindu coalition and possibly even our foreign secretary, who is in Washington right now, pushed hard for some sort of statement from the president. And it was decided, well, even before this, I should add, the White House spokesperson did make a statement before Trump spoke.
Right.
And then it was incorporated, obviously, in the speech.
Okay, so you're saying that the immigrant community is obviously not high up there on his agenda, but when it comes to foreign policy, we've seen Venkaiah Naidu ask the president to take a stance and say something when it came to Kuchibhotla's murder. Do you think that too is not part of Trump's agenda at this point in time? That
I'd be very surprised if Naidu's comments ever made it to Trump's attention at all.
Okay, all right. So we've gotten that little bit out of the way, but here's also what Donald Trump had to say about his biggest promise to the Americans. Listen in.
It's been a little over a month since my inauguration, and I want to take this moment to update the nation on the progress I've made in keeping those promises. Since my election, Ford, Fiat Chrysler, General Motors, Sprint, SoftBank, Lockheed, Intel, Walmart, and many others have announced that they will invest billions and billions of dollars in the United States and will create tens of thousands of new American jobs.
All right, Glenn, Trump again going back to his rhetoric of creating jobs in the United States. But realistically speaking, do you feel that these companies will be able to deliver on those promises of creating those new jobs?
Well, the one-word answer is no. If creating jobs in the U.S. is also going to improve the standard of living, the level of employment, and national wealth. I mean, it is possible to be protectionist and to oblige jobs to be placed in the United States, but that will then not just harm competitiveness, it will make America uncompetitive. One concrete example, steel produced in the United States that Trump has touted as now being used for the pipeline that he is forcing through the Indian reservation in North or South Dakota, costs 70 to 80% more per unit of production than the steel that has been used up to now. So yes, you can produce American steel for this specific task or for Detroit's automobile industry at 70 to 80% greater cost. That will create jobs for the steel industry, but overall harm the economic well-being of the United States. So it's doable, but it's not doable in a way that will increase national wealth, but rather harm it.
Pramitpal, when we're looking at the feasibility of this new plan of creating new jobs, now if that were an option, wouldn't it have already happened before? How does Donald Trump plan on executing this idea of bringing jobs back to America and making sure that people don't take their businesses outside of the United States? Is it really that simple?
No, what he has said, correct. I mean, you would have to change, you'd have to shift the playing field on which the economics of this works. If you just go purely by the question of cost benefit, then automatically what is the cheapest bidder gets the L1, as we call it in India, would automatically win, and the bulk of that would not be American, because American manufacturing is expensive. What he has to do, therefore, what he's planning to do, is he said he'll introduce a border tax, which would effectively be like a tariff, so that any product that comes from overseas would effectively have a tariff imposed on them, and so then that would automatically raise the cost of that product. And therefore then an American, theoretically an American manufacturer could compete against those imports. But interestingly enough, in his speech, he doesn't really mention that he didn't go into the border tax very much. He emphasized, in fact, that he wanted to reduce the tariff barriers of other countries which American companies are exporting to. So yes, he could theoretically change the balance in which these contracts work through. And he's also mentioned that he will make government procurement. In other words, when the government buys something, they will be forced to buy American products, made in America, buy in America. He can't force the private sector to do that.
Right.
So yes, there'll be some shifts he can do just by changing the policies on the ground. But broadly, the real issue is going to be that to really compete, most American companies, what they're doing is automating, as is true everywhere in the world, including in India. And that means there's no jobs. So you can become more efficient as a manufacturer in the United States. But to do so, you basically do so by getting rid of the workers. So you'll still be made in America, but it will not be made by human beings.
Right, and just looking at the entire speech, even though it was more president-like, as both you and Glenn have mentioned, but when it comes to making those explanatory points, putting things into perspective, how exactly are jobs could be created, do you think he still missed out by doing that? For instance, the border tax, it didn't come up. So do you feel that Donald Trump has once again done what he's done through his campaign by sort of repeating these campaign promises, but slightly differently?
Well, as you mentioned, as was mentioned earlier, State of the Union address is very broad sweep. So you're never going to get into too much technicality. In fact, he spent a lot more time talking in detail, some detail anyway, about the healthcare proposals, how dismantling Obamacare and replacing it with his version of universal. That was the only policy area where he actually did spend a fair amount of time, at least outlining the principles which that would be driven by. But everywhere else, yes, he just made some broad statements. But that's pretty normal for State of the Union addresses. The details will have to come out much later.
Okay. So, in fact, we are going to talk about Obamacare in just a bit, but just also to move on to a little bit more that Donald Trump did talk about when it came to Islamic terror. He did, repeat his tough talk, especially on the Islamic State. Here's what he had to say about that aspect.
As promised, I directed the Department of Defense to develop a plan to demolish and destroy ISIS, a network of lawless savages that have slaughtered Muslims and Christians and men and women and children of all faiths and all beliefs. We will work with our allies, including our friends and allies in the Muslim world, to extinguish this vile enemy from our planet.
Glenn Carl, what exactly do you think all of this is going to mean? Is Donald Trump planning on redrawing his plan for the war against ISIS?
Well, it's easy to denounce the horrors that ISIS commits and to oppose them. That's, this is a straightforward thing that no one will object to, and it is exciting and attractive to sound tough, to take hardline postures. But in practice, conceptually, what he has said has always actually been an approach that will harm American interests by denouncing de facto an entire faith you're not setting yourself up to eradicate a problem at all. And to characterize the Islamic terrorist threat as a discrete group like ISIS misses the larger issue, the fundamental challenge, which is why the Obama administration and General McMaster, now the National Security Advisor, wisely avoid using the term radical Islamic terrorism. So he's conflating all sorts of problems and simplifying them in a way that actually makes it sound like an achievable task. But then when you ask yourself two questions: how do you get ISIS, the discrete group, one, and how do you stop radical Islamic terrorism, two, then the posture sort of falls apart. Unless Donald Trump is willing to deploy large numbers of American soldiers on the ground in Syria, at which point, in which case we could destroy ISIS probably in 2 weeks. But then what happens? Because as General Powell said years ago, if you break it, you own it. And we found that in Iraq. So either we occupy the country, which would create endless problems and harm to American blood and treasure, or you have to do something which is a more standoff problem. One, that's for ISIS. And two, the phenomenon itself, you don't eliminate by denouncing a religion. You approach it in a much more holistic, organic, sociological way, which is a long-term and very frustrating process, which is not what Donald Trump is talking about at all.
Right. Pramit, in fact, this war on Islamic terror has been really key to Donald Trump's campaign. He talked about it endlessly during that time. And also the attacks that have taken place, for instance, in France, he was very quick to tweet about it and called it or condemned it as an Islamic terrorist attack very quickly after. But when it comes to tackling the problem of the Islamic State, it's not something that's new to the United States. What different really can Donald Trump do from the Obama regime when it comes to IS?
I don't think he has to do very much. The IS is in terms of actual battlefield position, IS is crumbling. IS has been slowly losing ground over the past 1.5 years. And if Mosul falls within the next, 4 or 5 months, maybe even a year, by the end of this year or the middle of next year, most of the IS, between the Russian-supported attacks on one side, the Iranian attacks on the other, and the Iraqi US-backed attacks on the other, physically the Islamic State will probably cease to exist. That does not mean the Islamic State will disappear, or should we say the marginalization of Sunni Arab sentiment, which is driving the first creation of Al-Qaeda and now IS, will remain, and something will take its place, presumably a few years or a year later. That will not be solved. But the Islamic State as a whole, he doesn't have to do very much if he could just add a little more support. One of the things we're hearing now, for example, is that in the new visa ban system that he's going to be introducing, Iraq will be dropped.
Yes.
And that would make perfect sense because it was ridiculous. Iraq was fighting on behalf of, with the United States, against the Islamic State. So by putting a visa ban in Iraq, the Iraqis rightly said, why are we with the United States and fighting the IS? And so I think that's sensibly enough between McMaster, Tillerson, and Mattis. They came in and said this is a ridiculous policy. And I think you'll notice he's referred to friends and allies in the Muslim world. And I think in that case in particular that was about Iraq, that he has to bring them on board. He is working with them and he can't get around that. But I think the real issue is going to be for him is that his policies and alienation of Muslims in America, and you could argue therefore also Muslims to some degree in Europe, will mean that the other side of the Islamicist threat that they're facing is these lone wolf attacks or little terror networks in Europe and America and so on. And that will probably possibly increase.
Right.
Part of the alienation that they feel or that is driving part of that at least, will increase under Trump. He's definitely not done any outreach to those communities. So I have a suspicion the real test for Trump is going to be when he faces a homegrown terror attack in the United States.
Okay. Would you agree, Glenn, with Pramit Pal's understanding or analysis of this, that it's not just going to be the Islamic State that is the enemy at this point in time, but it is homegrown terror and the alienated Muslim community within the United States that's going to be the real challenge for Donald Trump during his 4-year president term?
I completely agree. I've been writing and speaking about this for 20 years, 15 years since I left the CIA. That's exactly the issue, is that the statements that Donald Trump made weren't just misleading. They are consistently wrong about the nature of the threat. The threat domestically in the United States is not from ISIS or Al-Qaeda or some group sending terrorists to come kill me or my family members or Donald Trump himself. That occurs on occasion. But most attacks now across the world, in France, in Belgium, in Germany, in the United States, are what my colleague characterized accurately as the lone wolf attacks. These are disaffected individuals who identify with the romantic message of heroism of ISIS and jihad, and then strike out. And the data supports this overwhelmingly. Most of the attacks in the United States that have occurred, and there have been very few, but there have been some, are from this kind of lone wolf inspired jihadist. None of the immigrants, refugees, Muslim refugees who have come to the United States, I think that's a literally true statement, none of the many thousands of them have been found to be radicalized. The statement that Donald Trump has made his election around, to a large extent, which is that there's no vetting and that people are pouring in, all of that is completely wrong. The vetting, and I did it, part of my work, is exceptionally rigorous.
Right.
It's never perfect. So it's the inspired jihadists, not people being sent by ISIS. They simply have not really done that.
Okay, we're running out of time, Glenn, but you did bring up immigrants, so I'm going to skip running that particular part of his speech, but to just talk about, the merit-based system as far as immigration goes. He brought that up, saying that it runs in some other countries as well. But do you think, Glenn, that he can implement this, so to speak, merit-based system when it comes to allowing people into the United States?
Well, yes, I was a little surprised to hear him say that he's going to implement that, since that is fundamentally the policy of the United States for many years. There are incentives or greater possibilities for people with professional skills that are desired by the American economy. That already is the case. And then family reunification has been also part of the law. So for him to say he will make that possible, I'm sure it's possible to make it even more encouraging in immigration policy and law, but that is the policy of the United States.
Pramit Pal, do you think that the bigger problem for Donald Trump's immigration plan isn't going to be implementing what Glenn is saying is already a system that is in place, but dealing with the fear that's going to accompany this restriction on immigration and the sort of alienation it might cause to specifically Muslim immigrants into the United States, but a larger community as well?
Oh, we just don't know what the basis of what he's describing is what the Canadians and the Australians call a point-based system.
Yes.
So it depends on what points he decides to set. So depending on what the criteria, now presume all immigration policies anywhere in the world already have a criteria system. The question, what seems to be the case he wants to change the nature of the criteria. Until he tells us what the criteria is, we have absolutely no means to judge. But what he seems to indicate, and I think this is something the Indian government is particularly happy about, is that the focus will be, the tough action will be on illegal migration, but legal migration, we will set up a point system. Now, what does the points, if as you said, if I'm a Muslim and it says that if you happen to be from a Muslim religious background, your point is 0, as opposed to if you're a Christian, your points are 100, then obviously there's going to be some backlash on that. But that's probably not legal. I mean, it will probably immediately go to courts and they'll say you can't do this on the basis of. But what you you can do, is things like English speaking. And that's exactly what the Australians do. One of the reasons for the huge surge in Indian migration to Australia was the fact that they changed the criteria, and English-speaking capacity became one of the highest points that you could gain. Automatically, the numbers of Indians increased, and the number of Arabs decreased, for example,
right.
Which led to criticism that this was exactly what the policy was about. Luckily for the Australians, the man who put the policy together was an Indian-born Muslim, Australian citizen, but who's originally from India, an Indian from Hyderabad. So again, what criteria he sets is going to be crucial, and we don't know what that is yet.
Okay, but when it comes to this point-based system, one of the things that I think a lot of Indians feel about the visa process when it comes to the US is it is tough, but at least at the end of the day, you are speaking to another human being on the other side. So, but taking that interaction out of it, if it is going to become plain and simple, a computerized sort of system, isn't that going to be a worry for skilled workers in India?
Well, I don't know. There are two different points. When you talk merit-based, you're often talking about people who are becoming immigrants, actually becoming citizens. It's not clear yet what he's talking about in terms of temporary work visas, which he doesn't go into in this speech.
Right.
That's where the H-1B comes into. But I would be surprised. I am pretty certain that an interview will still remain compulsory.
Okay, so it's still going to be part of that.
The point system doesn't make any difference as far as that is concerned.
All right. So we've just got enough time to quickly run our viewers through what Mr. Trump had to say about Obamacare. Let's quickly listen into that.
Action is not a choice, it is a necessity. So I am calling on all Democrats and Republicans in Congress to work with us to save Americans from this imploding Obamacare disaster. Here are the principles that should guide Congress as we move to create a better health care system for all Americans. First, we should ensure that Americans with pre-existing conditions have access to coverage and that we have a stable transition for Americans currently enrolled in the health care exchanges.
Okay, we've got time for closing comments specifically on Obamacare. Glenn, to you first. What do you make of what Mr. Trump had to say about easing out Obamacare?
Well, Trump has been consistently contradictory in his positions in his campaign and now as president. He is at odds with the Republican base because he tends to emotionally or intellectually support positions that are more traditionally Democratic, which is to maintain care, not take people off the rolls, and so on.
Right.
And yet here he's also consistently called it a disaster. So he's not going to please his Republicans who need to support this by what he said, and it's unclear really what he means, except it sounds like there will be a delay because he won't throw the baby out with the bathwater entirely.
Pramit?
Well, I think that's the point, is that he wants universal health care. He wants to expand Obamacare to incorporate the roughly 20 million Americans who are not covered by Obamacare. So Obama probably would say, yes, this is what I always wanted. It was the Republicans who never let me do it, which is why I had to come up with a messy compromise solution. So Trump is in effect, and as was correctly said, Trump is a populist. So he's actually, his economics, ironically, is quite left-wing. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens with the Republican Congress, who are dead against us. And they have to pass the legislation, and they have to sanction the money for this. And I have a suspicion that a lot of them will play a guerrilla battle with their president to try and delay and delay and delay a bill that they ideologically don't actually support.
And ironically, that might just be the first test Mr. Trump faces from his own cadre of the Republicans. But we've got to wrap up the show on that note. Pramit Pal, thanks for joining us here in the studio. Also, Glenn Carl from Boston, thanks for weighing in with your perspective. It's a wrap on Gravitas for tonight. Thanks for joining us here on the show. We'll be back with more news in just a bit. Stay tuned to WION.